All right, I thought I'd go ahead and do a video um, on just a couple things. Let's look a little more on solving equations. And I'm going to look at ones where you have problems that have fractions and decimals in them. Okay, so if you have a problem like this, it has decimals in it, I don't recommend you do anything to clear the decimals because you have a calculator that you can use. So it doesn't really help, kind of causes big numbers. So just deal with the problems involving decimals the same way you would if there weren't decimals. So, you'd add 2, and you may not know how to do that by hand, but that's okay. You just put in 7.5 plus 2, and it's going to tell you 9.5. You added 2 because that knocks out the negative 2. And on the left side, you'd have negative 1.5x. So to finish that problem, you'd need to divide to get rid of that negative 1.5. You're going to do that on both sides so that this turns into just x. And then you take your 9.5 and you divide by negative 1.5. I don't have my calculator handy, so let me get that, find that real quick. Should have grabbed that before I started my video. All right, so let me take, I know it's negative, and what I get is a negative. And it turns out too, when I do it on my calculator and it gives me a decimal, it gives this particular one winds up being, let me make sure I did it right. Okay, so I did 9.5 divided by 1.5, but I know it's negative. And it wound up giving me negative 6.3 repeating. Now, normally if something's a decimal, you're going to keep it a decimal. And that it turned out to be negative 6 point, and then the 3's just kept going like that. So this one, it might actually work better to write it as a fraction or a mixed number. So like negative 6.333 is negative 6 1/3. And that's the same as negative 19/3. And you can use some keys on your calculator that'll allow you to change back and forth between fractions and decimals. And then there's one that'll allow you to change back and forth between mixed numbers and improper fractions. I'm not sure how it writes it. It may say like D over E, something like that. Okay. Or it may say D over C. I can't remember. But anyway, it's a button above, right in the fraction area. So this one goes from mixed number to an improper fraction. And then this is the one that goes between fractions and decimals. Okay, so you can use those if you want. I don't recommend that you get rid of the fractions when you're doing problems like this. Okay. All right, so this right here might be your answer, or they might have you round to the nearest tenth, or maybe it'll be multiple choice. So if they round, it'll be negative 6.3. A lot of times you round and you look at the decimal, the digit after what you're rounding to. So if I was rounding to one decimal place, I'd look at how that's a 3 and I'd round this just to negative 6.3. But rounding is not okay unless they say it's okay. All right, let's try another one. Here's one that involves decimals. Okay, this one's going to be hard, not because of the decimal, but because there's an X on both sides. Okay, and so what you might want to do there is go ahead. Now we're used to moving the X to the left-hand side, so you just need to be careful on this one. If you did that, so a lot of us think to move the X's to the left. It's not a bad idea, but if you did that, you've got to leave the equal sign equals 0 at that point. Then you'd have 1x minus 2 equals 0. And so when you add 2, you'd find out that x would equal 2. 1x is the same as x, and it would just equal 2. Okay, so I think this one might have been kind of a challenge just because the variable was on both sides. Now it's like, if you were to do this one, it's like somebody moved the numbers to the left. So another approach you might have thought to do that would have been correct would be to move the variable to the right. It's just that you'd have negative 1x, and then you'd have to divide by a negative 1 to get x equal 2. So either of those would be okay. All right, let me do just a couple more, and then I'll post this video. Don't get overly, obsessed with it. We just want to be sure we can do the ones that are in the review. I just felt like I wanted to show you a few more. All right, so here's another one. Now we could clear the decimals out by picking a number that we could use that would move the decimal place to the right one spot, and then all of these wouldn't have decimals anymore. But then they would be pretty large numbers. So you might find it easier just to notice that there's Q's in multiple places on the left side. So you'll want to combine those. So you're going to take a positive 2.6, and then you're going to take a negative 5.1, and that would give you a negative 2.5 Q. Then I'm just going to bring down the negative 3.5, and I'm going to keep the right-hand side as is for now. So that would have been my first step. So I don't recommend you clear the fractions because decimals handle those, clear the decimals, because calculators handle those so well. Okay. At this point, I would move my Q's together by adding 1.5 Q to both sides. That would leave me a negative 3.5 on the right, and it would leave me a negative 1 Q or negative Q on the left. Okay. Now I'm going to come in here and I'm going to add 3.5 to both sides. And something weird happens. I get a negative 1 Q on the left, and on the right, I get 0. Okay, 0 is a number just like any other number, so don't think that means that you did something wrong. That can happen. It just doesn't happen very often. And it doesn't mean that it's undefined. See, I can divide that negative 1 to get rid of it, and I'll have Q equals 0. Okay, so in order for this to be a true statement, what we're saying is you'd have to plug in a 0 for Q, and that would be your answer. All right, let's look at one more decimal one. I'm pulling these examples off a handout, and then we'll do some more that come from the review. Okay. All right, so I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing some parentheses. And if I'm going to not try to, let me go back. I've been sitting in the session, but nobody was joining me. Yeah, no one's there. All right, let me go back to my video. Okay, so what I would do is just go ahead and multiply the 6 times the 0.30. Okay, and so that would be 1.8. Bring down the 0.05x. I would take this 0.15 and I would distribute it. Okay, so let's see, that would be 36 plus, that would be 3.6, I should have said, plus 0.15x. So all I did was distribute the 0.15. So that meant it got multiplied by 24, then it got multiplied by the x. Then at that point, I have x's on both sides. So that's when I like to bring my x's together on the left. And we aren't really spending time how to do that by hand. Just do that on your calculator. Type in 0.05 and then plus negative 0.15, and you should get a negative 0.10x. And you can put the leading 0 in there just to help you keep it straight. We still have the 1.8. On the right side, we have the 3.6, and then we subtracted 0.15x, so the x's would go away. So let's subtract the 1.8 from both sides. Okay, when I do, I'm left with a negative 0.10x equals, and then 3.6 take away 1.8 would be a positive 1.8. Okay, now this negative 0.10 is multiplied by x, so I'm going to divide by it. Okay. All right, so when I do that, that gives me the x by itself. And then let's see, over here, I would get negative 8. Oops, that's a 1.8. Let me do that again. I would get negative 18, okay, for my final answer. All right, now these are equations, so if you wanted to check them, you could. Just be sure you go back to the original and plug in everywhere you see the x, and then follow order of operations very carefully. And make sure when you plug in a negative 18, that you follow your order of operations and that it all works out like you're expecting. Okay, so for instance, on this one, on the right side, we get 0.15, and then 24 minus 18, that would be 8. On the left side, we'd get the 0.30 times 6, which is the 1.8. The 5 times 18, that's 90. So I'd get 10%. I'd get 0.5 times that. Let's see, half of that would be 9. Trying to get the decimal point right. I think that's just 0.9. Okay. All right, so let me double check that. I mess up on decimals more than I do on fractions. I want to make sure I don't do the wrong thing. So let me take that 0.05 times the 18 again. It's 0.9 and it's negative. 1.8 minus 0.9 gives me a negative 0.9. Over on the other side, we multiply 0.15 times 8. Ooh, and I don't get the same thing. I got 1.2. That tells me I may have messed up somewhere. Okay, so let me just double check. Sure don't want to mess up. Okay. All right, and then over here, 24 minus 18. Oh, that's where I messed up. 24 and a negative 18 isn't 8, it's 6. And when I do 6 times 0.15, I do get the negative 0.9 that I'm expecting. Actually, the positive 0.9 that I'm expecting. All right, so as you can see, I mess up more on the check than I did on the regular problem. This actually turned out to be correct, but I thought it was wrong because my check was not working. All right, so there were 4 problems involving decimals. So just wanted to share a few more of those, and I'll